Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about building in the cloud with Bicep. First, I want to thank all of the amazing sponsors that are helping put this on and all the staff that's helping organize and deliver this. So, a little bit about myself. My name is Chris Ayers. I'm a senior customer engineer at Microsoft. I work in the fast track for Azure team, and we help customers deploy their solutions to Azure more quickly, more effectively, and at scale. So we help de-risk that. Now I'm on Twitter. You can find me there. I tweet and share lots of cool and interesting things. I'm on LinkedIn. I occasionally blog, and all the samples and things I'm going to be talking about today are up on GitHub. So you can go and find them, and I'm going to be referring to that repo quite a bit. So you can use that and walk through. So there's a couple things I want to talk about before we dive right into Bicep. What is infrastructure as code? What's the difference between declarative and imperative? And as we start talking about building for the cloud, what is Azure and ARM? I'll give you a couple of small differences between ARM templates and Bicep, and then we're just going to do lots of demos, lots of conversation. We got a lot to cover, but this should be fun. This is the definition I always use with DevOps. I always like to start with it. Diamond Brown's quote: "DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users." And I like to keep that in mind because it's about that stream of delivery, and it's not one tool. It's usually a mindset. But let's dive in. So infrastructure as code. That is managing our infrastructure, our network, our VMs, our connections in a descriptive model. We're going to use Bicep files in this example, but this is going to let us check them in. We're going to be able to use repositories to share and store those, and we can have a Git hub workflow to review and merge our changes into production. And we'll talk about all that. So I said declarative. There's usually been two styles of infrastructure as code through time. We've got that imperative style, which maybe you're used to a series of scripts with a series of commands. Uh, do this thing, do that thing, do this other thing. So you kind of have to know the state of the system, and you kind of have to manage your own dependencies. And so you might do a lot of polling. Hey, is that thing I asked for done yet? Um, can you make assumptions about where the system is? So you have a lot of responsibility put on yourself when you're dealing with imperative scripts, error checking, handling, retry logic, dependencies, all that. With declarative, you pretty much just describe what you want in the system. You say, I want the thing, and you let the system figure out the current state. You let the system figure out where it needs to go and all of the steps that happen in between. Like a lot of times, it'll handle dependencies, it'll handle retries, all that stuff. Visualizing it a little different way. This is where under imperative we might have to ask all these questions and create things if they don't exist. Where with declarative, we just define a whole bunch of resources that we want. And that's how Bicep is. Bicep is a declarative language. So why is declarative infrastructure as code super important? Well, it's a single source of truth. You just define what you want, and that's how the system should look. It's repeatable, it's testable, because you're not writing all this extra logic and retry, and you're trying to coordinate resources, maybe through multiple deployments. It can decrease your provisioning time. It's also what we call idempotent, and that's a term you hear a lot when you talk about infrastructure as code. It means you can apply it and run it over and over again with the exact same configuration and get the exact same result every time. And because it's checked in and because you can do, pull requests and have a review process on it, you can see all the changes as they go into the system. It makes it super powerful. That means as we build out environments, we don't have unique uh, servers or configurations. We can run it and reset configuration back to how we defined it. This will help reduce human error, and we can make things more secure. So there's a lot of reasons. But as we talk about building in the cloud, we have to talk about ARM. And ARM and Azure, ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. This is the thing that is the control plane. And there's lots of ways to interact with the Azure control plane. Like you can go through the portal. The portal will hit REST APIs for ARM, and that will be how you can create resource groups or storage accounts or web apps. You can use PowerShell or the CLI. Those will interact with SDKs to talk to ARM. And the Azure Resource Manager, has all of that authentication built in. So anytime we're doing stuff with Bicep, we're interacting with ARM, the Azure Resource Manager. Now, Bicep is going to be a file. It's going to be just a template file. I'm going to show it to you in a second. This is different than how we've done things in the past. In the past, we had a JSON file called an ARM template. And this was a very big, long, wordy document. It was very verbose. It made editing them and creating them and working with them very difficult and slow. Bicep files, by comparison, are much cleaner. I know this is a little fuzzy. I'm gonna have ARM templates up or Bicep files up. We're gonna be zooming in, and I'll make sure it's readable. But on the left, we're just defining a storage account. We have a couple of variables or parameters, and we have a resource. On the right, we have a big, huge block of JSON that defines the exact same thing. It's just not as pretty, not as easy to work with. Now, another feature of Bicep, and we're going to go through all this in our demos, is we can leverage modules. So we can start having these reusable chunks of infrastructure defined that we might leverage across multiple solutions, where we might have a reusable network module that we use in two different solutions. We might have an app module that we've customized and configured for our solution. And because we have modules, there's also options around outputs and parameters. So we can take the output of one module and pass some of those things into another module. Now I know this might be confusing at first, but we're going to dive into it shortly so that it's all covered. And because we have templates that have values coming in, we can leverage parameters. We can pass those as a command line argument, we can pass them as files, and we have control over that. So let's start playing around with uh, Bicep some. I'm trying to find my, there it is. So this is what a Bicep file looks like. Just make it nice and big. And when we're dealing with Bicep, the Visual Studio Code actually has an incredible extension for Bicep. So if I look for Bicep, I've got this extension here that you can leverage with Visual Studio Code, and this will do syntax highlighting and validation and IntelliSense. It's really powerful. It's really great. Now, the other thing we're going to need when we're dealing with Bicep, now you can do it through PowerShell, but I'm a big fan of the AZ CLI. So with the CLI, you can build and deploy Bicep stuff locally, and that's what we're going to do. So there's a couple of keywords and important concepts as we build things in Bicep. And one of them is we're deploying Azure Resources. So we're going to be deploying a resource. So one of the keywords we're going to see is resource. Now, I'm building a storage account. This is just a friendly name. This is a symbolic name for me. The thing that's important is this part here. This is the type of resource through the resource provider. This is an Azure thing, and the API version. So because I'm leveraging Visual Studio Code, I can do resource, I want a storage account. See, there's a huge list of things that, IntelliSense is helping me fill out and provide. Those are all listed out in the Azure portal. I will show that momentarily, but you know, I have the resource type, and then there's this thing here. This is the version. There's like an API version. Uh, ARM has, like, for storage accounts, there are multiple API versions that are available going back many years. I usually recommend to people try to use the latest version of the API when possible. This is just the name for me to reference internally in my Bicep stuff. This is the actual name of the resource that we're going to be trying to create in Azure. It requires a location, where am I building this resource? And then there's some specific type of properties that are very resource dependent. So some resources have a SKU. You might not know all about the various SKUs of storage accounts, and that's okay. Sometimes the tooling will handle it for you, so I can uh, you leverage the tooling to help, and all of those properties are published out through Microsoft. Like kind is an important property for storage accounts. Now, this stuff, like I said, we can find out about it out on the Azure portal. So if I look up Bicep Storage account, we can go look at all of the different resources and see, hey, here's that storage account. Here's our Bicep template. If we wanted to see the equivalent JSON file, there it is for ARM. And we can see all of the properties. And we also have some additional information down here if we care. That's a little tight because I'm zoomed in. So let me just zoom out once or twice. You can see if it's required. You can see a good description of every single property and additional parts about it. You most likely won't need all of this, but let's go back. And so one of the things I'm doing, because I'm going to use the AZ CLI, is I'll need to log in. So this will open a browser. I can log into my account, and then that gets authenticated, and my tenants get set. I can, if I want to deploy from a command line a bicep file, make sure I'm in the right directory. I am. I need a resource group. So you can deploy bicep files at any scope. There's lots of options. You can deploy it at a subscription or a management group level. You can deploy it as just a resource group level. So I can do a deployment group. So I'm going to do an AZ deployment. I'm going to do it to a group. I have a resource group already set. And then I'm going to say, I want to use a template file. I'm going to use my main bicep. Oh, I forgot one word. I forgot one word. And that is, I want to create this deployment. So I'm getting a warning. I'm getting a warning because I've hard coded that I want to build this in ECUS. So I can get some of that IntelliSense through Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to start speeding up through some of these topics as we go, just because there's a lot to cover. But um, yeah, so let's see here. So while that's running, let's go back up here. So this is that resource group I just pointed at. And if I take a look, there's a deployment running. And it looks like it just succeeded for me. So if I go back, I should see the resources pop up here momentarily. There it is. So I just made this storage account, and you can see some of the properties that get returned to me. The resource got created. Great. What if I want to create more than a storage account? What if I want to create multiple things? Well, we can do that too. So let's say we want to do not only a storage account, maybe I also want to do a web app. Now, web apps in Azure are built of two things. There's an app service plan, which is which you can see the resource type is server farm. So this is where my application is going to run. This is kind of like the server farm. And there's a SKU associated with it. There's different SKUs. There's also a location. And now I can make a website, an app service, a site, and I can give it a name. Now, some names are unique. So like the storage account here, that has to be globally unique. That name has to be unique across all of Azure. It's essentially like a DNS name. Now, my app service plan, that doesn't have to be unique across Azure. It doesn't even have to be unique across my subscriptions. It just needs to be unique inside my resource groups. You learn this stuff as you start building in the cloud more often. And you'll get errors occasionally, and you can also go and look at resources to figure that out. And then this also needs to be kind of unique across Azure. And now, a couple of important cool things here. I'm using that app service plan. Now, this is my friendly symbolic name I'm using inside my bicep. So I'm creating a resource here, and then I'm depending on it a little bit later saying, hey, give me that ID and assign it to this property. So I can now reference and kind of create dependencies between two different resources and use them. I'm just gonna hit up. So I've got in this file, in this folder, the same name. Still got the warnings. We're going to fix those in just a minute, but this is running. So this I will go check on it shortly. That should be building this app service plan and the server farm up in the cloud. Um, well, let's start taking care of some of these hard coded things. One of the options that we can start leveraging is we can parameterize our files. So what we can do is we can say at the top, I want a parameter. And this actually exposes a couple of cool concepts inside of Bicep. One is we can set a parameter so we can ask for things. And then we can also set a default value for those values, those parameters. So what that means is if I don't tell it the location, it's going to default to East US. Now, if I took this out and tried running it, so let me go into that directory and we will run this. So right now I have a value for East US and I have a value for these two, but I don't have a default value for my environment. So we're going to talk about what's happening, but see, I gave it some choices. I said it's allowed. It doesn't ask me about location and it's not asking me about my storage accounts names. It's going to do some stuff, which we'll talk about. But because I said I needed environment type parameter and I didn't give it one, it is asking me right now in the command prompt. And it actually, because it all the choices, it gives me a couple of options here. But let's look at some of what's happening in this file. Well, we're setting strings. That's easy. But then we've got this stuff over here. We got a dollar curly bracket. So we're going to do an expression inside of that. We're going to do some what's called string interpolation. It's going to combine this string, which we hard coded, and whatever's in the inside of these curly braces. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting is we've got this thing called unique string, and it's essentially like a function. What's nice about it is if you give it an input, like a seed value, like a time or a string, given that seed value, it'll always give you back out something repeatable. And so we're using our resource group ID as our seed value that has the subscription in it, that has the resource group name in it. And so if we moved this storage account to another subscription or resource group, we would get a different unique name. But if we start deploying it in the exact same resource group, we're going to keep getting the same string. So we can deploy this over and over again and get back that same unique string every time. Um, so we can do expressions, we can do little functions. There's a reference on all of those. I will show you guys that. We also can do this is called the tertiary operator, where you do the question mark and the colon. This is very common in JavaScript and like .NET, but we can do conditionals. Essentially, this is saying if the environment type is prod, do a globally redundant service. Otherwise, else give it a local. If it's prod, make it a P2, a big premium app service. Otherwise, make it a lower, free tier. So we've got all these parameters, and then we have a couple of local variables that we've built, and we just use them. So our storage account name, that was that parameter up above. We've just gone from saying, and I'll bring back up the previous version. We've gone from saying, hey, I want this string is my name to, hey, let's use this parameter as the name. Let's use this parameter as our SKU type. So we've got some flexibility now, and we can standardize all of our naming. We've got kind of a pattern going, and we can now pass in stuff to make it more reusable. And let's see if that deployed out there. I deployed it to the same place, and it did. Um, so this was when I deployed my web app manually, and now this is where we've got that unique string going. And I haven't made any changes. So if I were to just run the exact same thing again, it should come back. If I say non-prod, it should come back pretty quickly because the system already looks like it expects. We've already described the system. All right. So what if we to take this a step further? We've got some resources around our storage account, and we've got some resources around our app and our app service plan. Um, what are some things we might be able to do with that? Well, we could make modules. We could take all of this stuff and put it into a module. Let's take a look how that looks. So we've still got our strings, our parameters, our storage account, but here, so this is resource storage account, but here we're using a different word. We're using module. So we're saying, hey, there's a module that I'm going to call app service, and that module lives in this folder, in this file. So let's take a look real quick at that. So we've got app service, and this is a lot of the same stuff we saw before. We've got a location and a service name. We've got our prod environments, and we're using that to determine whether we're using the production size or the non-production size. So we've self-contained some of those dependencies around the app service, that the app service needs an app service plan, and all of that's kind of standardized. And we're outputting a service name. We're outputting the host name of that app service. So that's a property that once you spin up an app service, it has a URL. We're returning that from our module. And so notice we're not passing all the normal parameters to our module that we had before. We're passing only the ones that it needs and cares about. So it doesn't need storage account stuff because this is an isolated module. This just needs an app service name. It needs to know an environment type. That's how we've built it. And then we can get outputs. Just like we had outputs in our module, we can get outputs from our main bicep file. So we've taken this and kind of made it modular. Go back up and look. We still have those. Let's refresh that. We don't have multiple copies of things with these unique strings. They're all the same. Well, let's take a look about how the modules work a little bit more. And each time I'm deploying, by the way, what we've done is we're creating um, these deployments. So I can see these are the deployments that just happened. Those came from my template. And this is the compiled bicep. It gets compiled down into JSON. But I can see those. So notice we had outputs. Don't output secrets. Don't output connection strings. I'll show you a way that we can do that more securely. But do not pass usernames and passwords through outputs because they will show up here in the deployment screen, and you can see those. So we've got our modules. If I do my deployment, I'm only referencing the main module again. I'm not referencing any of the child modules, and I'm still getting those same type of questions. Now, this one was complaining because I was switching location. This I had up here as West 3 instead of East US. Like I said, in Azure, there's some restrictions. You some things you can rename, many things you can't easily rename, and you have to do some deletes and destroys. I'm going to show you how to be aware of those things very shortly. And I'm trying to speed up a little bit. So, let's say we've got parameters. Well, we have a lot of descriptions we can do about parameters. We can describe them. We can put allowed lists down, default values. We can specify min and max lengths or of strings or of numbers. So we have a lot of control and information that we can share as we write our bicep modules to the people consuming them so that when they're asked what type of SKU or what type of instance they need, they can understand what that's setting. So we can be descriptive and we can leverage those things. Now, here we made an object as a parameter where we can have a number of properties that are associated with each other. And that's getting passed in here, and we're referencing those individual properties. So we can do a lot with parameters. We can also save them out as a parameters JSON file. Now, this is just like we would with an ARM template. Um, and you can usually transform this pretty easily because this is a JSON file. So it's easy to reference like dot service plan dot value name and change things as need be. But we would invoke that on the command line, just like I'm doing with the template file. We would invoke that by saying parameters file or parameters and giving it file here. Now, one thing I skipped over very quickly was when you're doing this and you're getting questions about your parameters, you don't always have to wait for that to happen. We can pass those right on the command line. Um, so you can pass something directly like that without having to invoke it. So that's very easy to script and leverage in CI/CD pipelines. So I mentioned don't pass things around through outputs. Well, one thing you can do is you can, if you have to, have a key vault. Now you could create a key vault. You could set some secrets if you had usernames and passwords that you had to pass along. And how would you reference that? Well, you can have them referenced inside your parameters. Like you can have a key vault reference to an individual secret, so you can give it the ID of your key vault, which is just the resource path to your key vault, and then it can look up securely the secrets from there. And we can reference that um, just like a normal value. I was trying to, yeah, as a secure string. So those will get passed in and consumed. I've actually got a diagram on that. So your bicep file and your parameter file are going to have a secret reference to key vault, and bicep and arm will read that secret to be able to deploy those things together. All right. So let us keep going quickly. So we can also do conditional deployments. We saw earlier we had a couple of ifs, like if we want to, um, if we wanted to, if it was production, we were gonna do one size, or if we were not production, we would do another size. So we've got, maybe we're gonna say something like auditing is enabled, and we can have that be a value, true or false, depending upon what environment we're in. Well, we're leveraging a couple of these secrets, or a couple of these things here, but we're going to group together a name. We're going to make an account name based on a hard coded string, based on our location that we have, based on a unique string of our resource group. And then there's a limitation of 24 characters. So this is why this has a take of 24 characters. So we're building out, if auditing is enabled, true or false, and then we're building a storage account string. But where do we use that? Well, we use that right here. Maybe we want to do auditing. Well, only if auditing is enabled do we actually build out our storage account. If this is false, this doesn't happen. Like nothing there happens. And then down here also, we have a storage account. If it's production, we're going to leverage our storage account blob endpoint. But if it's not prod, we're not going to do anything. Just like, hey, we need an access key. I'm not going to look up an access key. I'm not copying and pasting access keys. This is Azure securely telling Azure, hey, if it's production, get those keys from that storage account, how it's allowed, connection strings, essentially access keys. Go find the primary access key and and assign that. Otherwise, it's blank. So we've got some conditionality now. Are we in dev? Are we in prod? Let's do things based on that. So we could do modules, we could do parameters. What about loops where we want to make multiple networks, multiple resource groups? Well, we can define arrays. They could be parameters, they can be variables. And what we can do is a very common syntax. We can do our for loop, our for in. So we've got a bracket here, and then we say for, and then a local friendly name in some sort of array. And then we've got that colon and brace. And so now this is going to be looped over for each item in the array. And this is that local friendly name we were using. It could be anything we had defined. And it will create three different storage accounts. Now, they might fail because those names are taken, but it will try to create those three. But what if we don't have a list? We just want to make some number of resources. Well, we can use a function called range. So, hey, for I in make some range 1 to 4, create a bunch of storage accounts in that range. We can do this looping over and over again. We've got some parameters. We have an array of stuff, and for location in locations. Sorry, I keep scrolling like that. This time we have location comma I, and that's because this is going to show off the index. It'll show 0, 1, 2, 3. And so we would say SQL Server 1, be that in West Europe, SQL Server 2, East US 2. So that's how you can access an index of a loop as you're going through it. What if you have an array of objects? So we can define out, hey, we have this whole configuration map. And notice there's no ending commas anywhere. We've got this configuration object. We have three of them. We can do some filtering on that. Maybe I only want to deploy for every SQL server if the SQL server is in production. So we can filter out only the production objects. And so it would loop through this and it would test yes, true, false, true. And so you would have two of these that would execute inside this copy block here. So we've got some really powerful options. We can do nested loops. So, um, for each location, we make a VNet. We do the 0, 1, 2. We use the indexes, and then maybe we also make additional subnets. So we can do nested loops inside of copy blocks. We can do uh, multiple loops. There's a lot of options with looping, um, and we can deploy out things. So we can make a module for a database. We have all of our database stuff, and what we can do, I'll just stick with this one. What we can do is we can just loop over that. So we can consume our module and have multiple instances of it that we're just passing in maybe a different location every time in the same username and password. We have those options. So we have a lot of building blocks. Um, Sometimes there's things that already exist. So as we're building out all sorts of resources, and you're going to see um, child resources and parent resources, things like, hey, I'm building a database account and a database, and these things are all related. And then this database has inside of it a container. We can do nested and child objects, but we can also work with existing objects. So let's say there's a log analytics workspace and we know the name of it, but we're not creating it in this bicep file. It's in a shared resource, or it's in another deployment or another resource group that is a shared source that we're going to consume that we're not creating in this file. Maybe we just want to say, hey, there's an existing object out there, existing object with this name. So now we have a reference inside of our bicep for these existing objects, and we can access properties that exist on those existing objects, because behind the scenes, what's going to happen is Azure is going to be able to go and look that up and set up that reference so that you can then, access tags or additional properties on those that you don't know right now, and you can dynamically respond to them. Now, I mentioned um, you can create things and see changes. Well, you can do what if. What if is a really cool capability. I can, instead of doing my AZ group deployment group create, you could do a what if. That is a command that will look at it's essentially going through a deployment, but instead of creating things, it's going to show you what would happen. Is something going to be created? Is something going to be destroyed? Is something going to be modified? Are we maybe going to tag something in a different way or update? So in this case, if I ran it, it would use these different resources in my subscription and create these different things and these properties. So if I like what I see, I could do create. I can also do, there's an option here where you can, yeah, confirm with what if. So you run the what if before it, and then you can acknowledge it. You can also say, hey, if there's absolutely no changes, if I know there's no changes, um, like you have some options. Proceed if no change. So you can review what's going to happen, and then you can say if you want to go forward or not. It gives you some cool options. Now I'm going to go ahead and create this. This is going to create some VNets, and I just want to show you, like I can change my cost center, update my team after this is done, and then maybe I want um, that to be one and that to be two. Let's see what would happen now if I did the what if on that. I should see a lot of little changes happening. So this is a great feature that you can leverage. Um, Now another thing you can leverage is modules. You can do modules in ACR. I'm just going to wait for that to run. So yep, here we go. We it changed some properties. It was going to update some things. It was going to delete and create some stuff. So we have a lot of power. Um, Maybe I want an ACR, so an Azure Container Registry. And the reason I might want to leverage an Azure Container Registry is I can publish my Bicep files, my Bicep modules out to an Azure Container Registry. I can share them and reference them inside of my modules, just like, whoops, I can share them and reference them. So we could have one pipeline or a place where we can publish modules out to ACR. This is just a module with properties, and you would just publish it by referencing the file and referencing your ACR and maybe the name of the module or resource you want to use. Now, how would I reference it? I can reference it like that, the same way. I'm going to use a Bicep resource reference. I reference my ACR, and I'm going to use that module and call it. Um, You can also kind of tweak your configuration so that you can have a little bit shorter, nicer names to reference things. And finally, just because we're getting short on time, we can have a sample app. And we a lot of times what I do is I have my source code and my infrastructure as code side by side inside a repository. These usually live together. My application depends on a database or a Redis cache or an event grid or service bus or something like that. And so my application depends on infrastructure, and my infrastructure exists for my application. They're coupled together. So I usually have them in the same resource together, it's the same repository, And maybe I'm just taking a web app name and I want to give it a SKU, or what Linux version I'm running. I have some modules around my web app, and I can output the web app name. At the time I run this, I might not know what my website name is. I might just build out my app service plan and build out my web app name, and I might not know what it is. It might be dynamic. So I like to output that. And the way I can consume that is in my GitHub workflows, in my GitHub actions. So I could have a workflow where I can build out my application. I'm going to check out my code. I'm going to build my .NET. I'm going to restore it. I'm going to build my source code and run my tests and publish my artifact and upload it. And now when we can deploy it. You just need to do an Azure login, and there's an ARM deploy step. This is a deploy step for ARM. We're leveraging our resources, and we're just referencing our bicep file. We're referencing the parameters just the same, and we can out on Azure um, build and deploy that. We've got our actions, and we can build our code, and we can deploy our web app out into Azure. Now, I'm over time. I'm sorry about that for anyone who follows me.